Would you even know how much you use or look at or touch or fiddle with or glance at your phone every day?
I'm sort of thinking there must be an app for that now. That'll be the next thing, an app that will tell you that you're in a danger zone, put the phone down.
You've had your 150.
And then you're drinking and phoning at the same time.
That's a bad combo.
It's all going to go completely pear-shaped. One or the other. One or the other.
You know, it probably does add up, doesn't it? You might think, oh, actually, I only look at my phone 30 times a day. And then you...
start counting.
Yeah, then you start counting.
But then what do you look? Is it email? Is it news? Is it?
It doesn't matter.
Social media. But when you add those things up, that's the thing, you can always make the justification. I'm looking at it for work, or I'm looking at it for news, or social media, or personal messages, or whatever.
Another test might be that kind of sense of some kind of discomfort if you can't find your phone. I suffer from that. If I lose my phone, I feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I guess I suffer from that.
So that might be a sign of addiction.
I suffer from a lesser version of that. Or a greater one, I don't know. My children, says Kathy of Hamilton, say because I don't drink, I have not prepared them for a drinking society and handling their alcohol. That was always the French argument, wasn't it? You bring children up from early age with, civil drinking. But I think it's turned out that the French have got just as higher rate of problem drinking as any other country.
I think the research in this part of the world is that is not the approach to take, and that there's still got to be a responsible introduction, but that it should be as late as possible. So it's encouraging of drinking with meal from early age. Is a lot of research says no, that's not the way. It's not the way to do it.
The issue here is different from the French issue, isn't it? The binge drinking culture here is what's different. And just watching my teenage son, 17, with 18-year-old friends, I'm actually really impressed with their approach to alcohol. I think their understanding of the problems is greater than my generation's was.
You've brought them up well.
That's that role modelling.
Yeah, that's that role modelling. But just before we go, not time for much more, but what do you think about this? California employers, excuse me, can no longer ask job applicants about a prior salary they may have earned, must provide them with a pay range for the job being advertised. It's called AB 168. This law, it applies to all public and private sector California employers. The idea is to narrow the gender wage gap if a woman's paid less than a man doing the same job and a new employer bases her pay on her prior salary. Gender discrimination is perpetuated. But it also applies to men as well, not knowing how much you can ask for, not knowing what anyone else doing the job earns. This is a good idea. You like this idea?
Well, it's aimed at addressing the gender pay gap, so it has to be inherently a good idea.
Does it even happen in New Zealand, though, that employers ask potential employees what they were paid? I've never experienced that.
Well, they would ask you what your salary expectations are, which subtly the same or subtly a different question depending on your point of view.
Yeah, they don't say the most we'll ever pay for this job is $59,000 a year. Oh, no. I suppose some of them do, but they try and fudge it, don't they?
I think if it does happen, it hasn't happened in my experience, but I think if it does happen here, then yeah, that's a blimmin' great idea, because of course it would perpetuate the gender pay gap if employers are basing their salary rates for employers on what they were paid before, because women will have been paid on average 12% less. So it's a great idea.
And we know what politicians earn, and the politicians don't complain that we know what they earn, do they?
No.
So why not other professions? That's the thing.
Broadcasters, Jim. Broadcasters.
Well, they earn so little, James. It's almost not worth talking about. James Elliott, Paula Penfold, thank you very much for coming on the panel today.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, everybody. We are back tomorrow, and Sharon Britt-Kelly with Checkpoint tonight.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Sharon Britt-Kelly, and on behalf of our team, welcome to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Tonight, investment in regional rail, a feasibility study on moving the ports of Auckland to Northland, an increase in the minimum wage to $20 an hour, free health checks for seniors and children. Tonight, as the Labour NZ First Green Coalition agreements are signed, we'll tell you what's in it for you. Also tonight, Northland voters tell us what they want out of the deal. National leader Bill English pledges to stay on till the next election. We're on the West Coast, where a man charged with murdering a Greymouth woman appears in court, and Destiny Church founders withdraw their application for charity from KidsCan.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. Labor has revealed the details of its agreements with New Zealand First and the Greens. The two agreements were signed this afternoon at Parliament by the incoming Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand First leader Winston Peters and the Green Party leader James Shaw. The centrepiece of Labor's coalition deal with New Zealand First is a focus on regional development with a new $1 billion development fund. Ms Ardern was asked how it would be funded.
Well, that comes from the $10 billion of unallocated capital spending that we've set out in our fiscal plan across 4 years. So that's where that fund comes from. It will be a combination of investment in, for instance, regional rail, heavy investment in forestry.
Jacinda Ardern. There were a couple of surprises in the New Zealand First Agreement, including new waka jumping legislation and a restart to negotiations on a free trade deal with Russia. Meanwhile, as expected, the Green Party agreement includes a referendum on legalising cannabis, as well as an overhaul of the welfare system, including removing excessive sanctions. And the Greens leader James Shaw paid tribute to Ms Ardern's skill in bringing together the separate agreements with New Zealand First and the Greens. He says the three parties have a great deal of policy in common.
I think one of the things that she and her team have done particularly skillfully over the course of the last few weeks is to make sure that those agreements are consistent with each other. And if you look at them, if you read the detail on them, there's actually a huge amount of crossover between both agreements and, in fact, the policies of all three parties. So this is, and I have been saying this since election night, that this is one of those cases where we have been looking for what is common between us, and I think that the two agreements represent that.
James Shaw. The agreement between Labor and New Zealand First includes policies to stop non-resident foreigners from buying houses in New Zealand. The Overseas Investment Act will also be strengthened. The New Zealand First leader Winston Peters says that sends a clear message.
The reality is there's going to be a change and a clear signal sent internationally that New Zealand is no longer for sale in the way it has been. And we're happy with that.
Winston Peters. And a plan to shift Auckland's port to Northland appears to be on the back burner, with New Zealand First and Labor agreeing only to look at the feasibility of moving the port. The New Zealand First wanted the car import trade moved north within 2 years and the rest of the council-owned port relocated within a decade. Labor's agreement with the Greens supports light rail from downtown Auckland to the airport. It also puts a hold on a major east-west highway across southern Auckland, backed by the trucking industry and the former government. Schools will get more funding for gifted students and safer cycling and walking routes for their students as a result of coalition and confidence and supply agreements signed today. The agreements signed by Labor, New Zealand First and the Greens also give New Zealand First an Associate Education Minister role in the next government. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
The agreements show which of the minor parties' policies the Labor-led government will advance in return for their support. The coalition deal with New Zealand First includes development of a 30-year strategic plan for education, free driver training for secondary school students, and piloting the provision of counsellors in primary schools. The agreement with the Green Party says the government will support priorities including ensuring all special needs children can participate fully in school life, providing safer cycling and walking around schools, and making tertiary education more affordable. Ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
And the National leader Bill English says he will stay on as party leader and contest the next election in 2020. He was unopposed in the party's caucus vote this afternoon. Mr English says the mood among his MPs was sober, but they were also positive the party was in a good position, especially considering National received more votes than Labor and New Zealand First combined. Two families from Tuvalu who sought to be New Zealand's first climate change refugees have had their cases rejected. The Immigration and Protection Tribunal has ruled they do not risk being persecuted under the Refugee Convention. Our immigration reporter Jill Bonnet has more.
The families in two separate cases argued they and their children wouldn't have access to clean and sanitary drinking water and that climate change would affect their livelihoods. They said life on Tuvalu wasn't sustainable because of rising sea levels, storms and king tides. But the tribunal said their claims didn't fall under any part of the Refugee Convention. More than a dozen people have applied for refugee status in New Zealand because of climate change, including the high-profile case of Ioane Teisiota from Kiribati, whose case was also rejected. But climate change was used successfully in an appeal against deportation to Tuvalu in a 2014 case, where the family also had strong family connections to New Zealand. This is Jill Bonnet.
It's 5:05. Centre Brad Takairangi will make his Kiwis Test debut after being named in the starting lineup for New Zealand's opening Rugby League World Cup match against Samoa in Auckland on Saturday. The 28-year-old Takairangi plays for Parramatta and has played 7 seasons in the NRL. Cody Nikorima will partner Sean Johnson in the halves, while Thomas Luluai will start at hooker. Prop Adam Blair will captain the side. The 15-year-old Christchurch skier Nico Porteous will become New Zealand's youngest Winter Olympian after being named in the team for February's Games in South Korea. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
A 9-strong team, which includes 6 teenagers, was named in Wanaka this afternoon, with Nico, who'll compete in the free ski halfpipe, named alongside his brother and fellow free skier Miguel. Others selected include free skiers Finn Bilius and Janina Kuzma, who returns for her second Olympics, having finished 5th in the half-pipe at Sochi in 2014. Also named were snowboarders Tian Collins, Rakai Tate, Zoe Sadowski-Sinnott and Carlos Garcia-Knight. Jamie Preble in ski cross rounds out the team. Further athletes will be selected over the next couple of months as they meet qualifying criteria, with additional free skiers and snowboarders, along with speed skating, skeleton and alpine ski competitors likely to be added, with a 20-strong team finally expected to go to South Korea. This is Stephen Hewson.
And that's the news.
Driving beats.
She's up there with hula hoops. She spends most of the concert wearing nothing but body paint. Watching particularly kids go, what the hell is that?
Driving dangerously.
These guys are idiots, and they're often blotto as well.
And driving the opposition.
They're more focused on how to ensure that the huge gains made in this country can continue and how to hold to account a government that's been put together in an unusual way.
Driving the news agenda. Morning reports weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, Samoa's first female Supreme Court judge, Mata Tuatangaloa, on how it takes a village to raise a child. And after 10, American writer Jonathan Eig on his new book on the boxing great Muhammad Ali. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service until midnight tomorrow. Northland to the Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Long, fine spells and isolated showers. Rain developing from Taranaki southwards tomorrow night. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, mostly fine, however a few showers this evening, possibly heavy. Showers returning to Wairarapa late tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Marlborough, Nelson. Mainly fine, however light rain tomorrow night. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, fine spells and a few showers. Rain in Fiordland this evening, spreading elsewhere tomorrow morning, briefly heavy, and rain will clear from the south tomorrow evening. For Canterbury and Otago, fine today, apart from isolated afternoon showers in the east. A period of rain spreading northwards tomorrow with southerlies. For Southland, mostly fine, but rain does develop overnight, then clearing tomorrow afternoon. And for the Chatham Islands, a period of rain today, followed by a few showers. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 5, and you're listening to Checkpoint with Sharon Brett Kelly.
Kia ora, Anna, and yes, I'm in for John Campbell tonight. Well, let's begin in Wellington, where highly secretive deals to form a government have finally been unveiled, revealing exactly how far Labour was prepared to go in order to take power. In a moment, we'll hear from our political editor, Jane Patterson, but first, Labour's leader, Jacinda Ardern, held signing ceremonies in Parliament this afternoon with the leaders of both New Zealand First and the Greens. The centrepiece of Labour's coalition deal with New Zealand First is a focus on regional development with a new $1 billion development fund.
There has been a period of neglect in the last 9 years for our regions. New Zealand First has brought enormous advocacy at the negotiating table to make sure that we see the beginnings of the reinvestment that is much needed in New Zealand.
But the deal didn't go as far as New Zealand First's Winston Peters would have liked on immigration, sticking to Labour's plan to reduce net migration by 20 to 30,000.
Look, I accept that, but we went into negotiations sincerely to try and get a resolution, and we're happy to accept the resolution the way the Labour Party has framed it. And it just so happens that there's an enormous amount of public controversy about those two issues right now, carried by you in the media and carried by experts. So maybe it'll work out.
Meanwhile, as expected, the Green Party agreement includes a referendum on legalising cannabis, as well as an overhaul of the welfare system, including removing excessive sanctions. The Greens leader James Shaw says it's an historic day.
I mean, the fact that we have the agreement, the fact that we are entering government for the first time, and that we have ministers who are going to be responsible for implementing a significant portion of the agenda that we campaigned on.
Well, joining us now is our political editor, Jane Patterson. Good afternoon, Jane.
Good afternoon, Sharon.
Let's look at the details of that deal first with New Zealand First. I mean, we're talking about a port feasibility study, immigration, lifting the minimum wage to $20 by 2020. Can you go through some of those main figures with us?
Sure thing. Now, it's obviously quite a complex deal. There are a lot of policies across several areas, but we'll just look at some of the more outstanding ones. And I think the main one is that $1 billion a year for regional infrastructure development. And of course, that was a really strong theme and a strong push from Winston Peters, the New Zealand First leader, through the campaign. We know that he's going to take the Foreign Ministry and he will also become Deputy Prime Minister. So I would imagine that Shane Jones, one of his MPs, would potentially take this economic development role and potentially an associate finance role as well that is in the deal with New Zealand First to be able to implement that big fund, that big annual fund. Now, other things in there, a couple of surprises really, and one is waka jumping legislation, and this harks back to the late 90s where any MP who leaves the party that they are elected to Parliament under, if they leave to go and support another side, they lose their seat in Parliament. So an electorate MP would have to go and, in a by-election and re-seek a mandate. A list MP would be gone altogether. Not a lot of detail really about why or the driving motivation for that, but that's in the deal with New Zealand First. And also working towards renegotiating or working towards restarting talks with Russia and the FTA. I suppose they were the two sort of surprising aspects. Immigration, there is just a commitment to work towards strengthening the labour market tests, basically making sure that migrants come here, that they are skilled. Now, Jacinda Ardern said there's not a number in the agreement with New Zealand First, but she's confident that once those measures are taken, that would actually end up with Labour's policy of reducing migration by about 20 to 30,000 people per year. Water quality, again a big campaign issue. Now, there won't be a water tax. That has been abandoned, and Winston Peters had in the campaign said that he would not support that. That is gone from the agreement. But there will be a bottled water levy, as Labour and the Greens and New Zealand First all supported. Ban on foreign buyers buying residential homes. That will be implemented. Jacinda Ardern also talking about plans to restrict access to farmland by foreign buyers. But she said that the OIO would be required. Anything over 5 hectares, the OIO would have to give approval. And she also said they'll be making sure that the OIO actually apply the tests that are in the current legislation, but they don't believe are applying stringently enough to farmland purchases. ETS, there'll be a climate change commission or a climate commission set up. They will decide how and when and if agriculture will be put into the emissions trading scheme and how that might look. Now, Jacinda Ardern said that was done so that those decisions are taken out of the hands and of politicians and into independent commissioners. There was also a reference to reforming and reviewing the Reserve Bank Act. Again, not a lot of detail in the agreement itself, but Ms Ardern said that measures such as employment and price stability would be taken into account, or they would want the Reserve Bank to look at taking those into account.
The Super Gold Smart Card, that's a beefing up of the existing, the gold card for superannuitants?
That's right, and that would include, for example, 1 free doctor's visits and other entitlements, and talk about a different card, so maybe like a flybys type mechanism. So not a lot of detail in the agreement, but that, and keeping the age at 65, the age of entitlement, is also part of the seniors policy that New Zealand First and Labour agreed.
So Jane, what would you say were the key things that Labour had to give up in this deal?
Well, we didn't get into that so much. It was more actually what New Zealand First maybe had to give up in the negotiations, and I'm sure that there are things that Labour gave ground on. I'd just like to talk about the Greens quickly, because of course the details of their deal were also revealed today, and that was the expected referendum on cannabis for personal use, and Jacinda Ardern confirmed that the government will move quickly to make access to medicinal cannabis legal. In terms of transport under that deal, the east-west motorway in Auckland, plans for that have been canned, but work will start on light rail from the city to the airport. And also, interestingly in there, especially given the exit of Materia Tude and the controversy around that before the election, in the deal is an overhaul of the welfare system, looking at excessive sanctions, and Jacinda Ardern named one, and that was having to name a father, for example, for single parent support. So expect a review of the welfare system and the Working for Families package as part of that deal.
And also announced a rent-to-own scheme.
That's right, and they hadn't actually put any particular system in place. James Shaw said that when he was in London there were quite a few different schemes, so not a lot of detail around that, but there are of course existing government schemes around accessing home deposits and that sort of thing, so they'll be looking at the suite of initiatives that are already in place, plus building on that to a potential rent-to-own scheme.
Also today, Jane, Bill English has announced that he's staying on as leader of the opposition.
That's right. So the National Party, while these deals were being signed and announced in one room in Parliament, the National Party caucus was meeting in another. They had a caucus meeting at 3 o'clock. Now, a leadership motion was put to that caucus, and it was in unanimous support of Bill English. He says that he will stay on as the leader of the National Party until 2020, and he will fight the next election. And not one person in that caucus opposed it or voted against it in that caucus meeting. Now, of course, he also talked about the new government. He talked about the mood in his National Party caucus as being positive but sober, the need for them to get and develop allies as they go into this term, a recognition that having lost two of their 3 support partners meant that they couldn't form a government. So exactly which parties they'll be and who they'll look to align with we'll obviously see as we go through the term. But Bill English firmly in the leadership of the National Party as of about an hour ago when he emerged from that caucus meeting.
And Jane, we'll be finding out tomorrow who is going to be in that cabinet, who's in that lineup and who gets what in terms of portfolios.
That's right. So we will get the full cabinet lineup tomorrow. That includes the Labour MPs, the Labour ministers, the New Zealand First ministers who will have cabinet positions, of course, and the Green ministers who have a confidence in supply deal, so they will be ministers outside of cabinet.
Thanks very much, Jane. That's our political editor, Jane Patterson. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the message from a number of Northland people to the incoming government. There's relief in some circles at the change to a Labour New Zealand First coalition, especially among those working at the coalface of deprivation. But there's also a feeling that some of the projects the old government started are worth keeping. Our Northland reporter Lois Williams filed this report.
Politicians are a bit like babies' nappies, that you should change them often for the same reason.
Now that is the plain-speaking Mr John Bain, Chair of the Northland Regional Transport Committee. Ask him what he thinks of Winston Peters' promise to move the Ports of Auckland container operation to Marsden Point and revive rail in the region, but he says the critical Northland issue for the new government is what it does with the Transport Agency's plan for a 4-lane highway from Auckland to Whangarei. If that project is scrapped, he says, the port's pie in the sky.
We can have all sorts of things go on there, but the reality is that to get the goods to point south, you have to have a very efficient system of transporting those containers or what comes out of the container. And then we could have a road system to move it wherever or a rail system. But the rail system is very expensive to take from the 1800s into the 21st century.
The NRC chair, Bill Shepherd, agrees with that. Rail and a container port may happen, he says, and the council's looking forward to working with a new government that campaigns so strongly on regional development. But he says whatever happens with rail, that 4-lane highway is critical to Northland's future.
Part of the reasoning for that has been the fact that 98.4% of Northland's freight goes by road, so that's why we were putting a lot of emphasis on that. So we'd be really keen to ensure that an incoming government maintains that momentum.
But in so many Northland communities, the burning issue is housing. Sherry Khan of Northland Child Poverty Action is a former government policy analyst. She says the new government could start by instructing Work and Income to give its clients some dignity, and by making decent housing its top priority to end transience and improve health.
Our society has changed so much, and so therefore what Winston was saying is that capitalism hasn't worked for many New Zealanders. It certainly hasn't worked for people up here.
But in Moerewa, the veteran community worker Ngaho Davis sounds a note of caution. The Māori Housing Network, a government initiative hard won by the now defunct Māori Party, has been funding the renovation of near-derelict homes in the town and changing the lives of the occupants. Only a few houses so far, but he's hoping the new government will see merit in expanding the scheme.
Because you've got a new government, they may see things differently, but I'm hoping that this is one of the projects they see as really beneficial for carrying on because it was ticking all the boxes in those areas of deprivation.
And the Northland Principals Federation President Pat Newman is hoping national standards will be gone by lunchtime, allowing schools to start planning now for a more diverse curriculum in 2018.
All of the arts, the music, the social studies, the phys ed, sports that have been basically missing of a heck of a lot of schools' timetables, I'm hoping that they come flooding back in because those are the things that make a child whole and make an adult whole.
On the street in Whangarei, farmers were a bit nervous.
I'm a livestock farmer. I don't like this carry on over the water and I don't like the idea of tax on the water that you use and things like that.
But others had high hopes, even celestial ones.
If everything we've been promised comes through, it could have great hope for the North. I think having 4 MPs in Northland is going to be brilliant. I think that's really, really good for us.
Personally, I didn't vote for either of them, but in the Bible it says, pray for those in authority over you. So that's what I'm going to do.
For Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
Abuse was yelled from the public gallery when a man charged with murdering a Greymouth woman appeared in court this morning. 43-year-old Hayley Williams was shot dead at a Marsden Road property on Sunday afternoon. After a 24-hour search by officers, a 45-year-old man was arrested near Hokitika yesterday. He appeared in the Greymouth District Court today, and our reporter Maya Burry was there. Earlier this afternoon, she told me via Live View what happened in court.
Well, a man who lives just outside of Greymouth appeared in court today over the charges. He was granted interim name suppression and entered no plea to this murder charge. But there were pretty tense scenes inside court. Several people had to be removed because they were disrupting proceedings. And one woman who appeared to be a supporter of Hayley Williams, she called the man a mongrel and then she was removed from court. But Judge Brian Callaghan remanded this man in custody until November the 10th when he'll appear in the Christchurch High Court via audio-visual link.
What do we know about Ms Williams? How did all this happen?
Yeah, there's still a lot of unanswered questions around that, Sharon. We're not quite clear on the relationship these two had. The police have said it wasn't a domestic relationship, but the pair were known to each other. So it's just not really clear how they were connected just yet. But we do know that Hayley Williams had 3 young children. A friend described her as a great mum who would, go out of her way for her boys. So really quite horrific that we then learned that the boys were, some of the children were home when this horrific shooting took place, but it's not quite clear what they witnessed.
And Maya, I understand a man charged with historical sexual offences at the West Coast religious community of Gloriavale also appeared in court today.
That's right, Sharon. It was a pretty busy day in the Greymouth District Court. Not a lot I can tell you around this one, as there are suppression orders in place, but what I can say is a man in his 40s was arrested in September over 2 charges of unlawful sexual connection and 2 charges of indecent assault. Today, Judge Brian Callaghan extended the name suppression for the man for another month. He'll reappear in the Greymouth District Court on November the 21st.
And that's our reporter Maya Burry in Greymouth. 2 of Destiny Church's charities will be deregistered next week if they don't file their 2016 and 2017 financial returns. The charities are on their final warning after ignoring 2 years of reminders and extensions. But while the church refuses to publish its finances, Destiny School went to the Kids Can charity asking for help to feed some of its students. And as Zach Fleming discovered, while the church was asking for charitable help, its founders Brian and Hannah Tamaki purchased a new Mercedes-Benz and moved into a new luxury home.
Beautifully laid out to separate the sleeping quarters.
This is the Tamaki's new home in Drury. 234 square metres. The real estate agent who sold it to them described it as having resort-like facilities. It has a spa and a heated pool.
The perfect party venue.
And the Tamakis are doing extensive redevelopment work on it. But interestingly, it's in their granddaughter's name. Bought in June for $1.6 million, the home is jointly owned by the Tamaki's lawyers and Eden O'Connor, also known as Eden Tamaki. She's just 22 years old. Brian and Hannah Tamaki live there though. They frequently post on social media about their livestock and renovations. But legally, they're not connected to the home at all. I rang the doorbell several times. Nobody answered, but both the couple's Mercedes-Benz cars, with a combined value of more than $200,000, were parked up. And I could hear talking. Excuse me, Brian. Brian, hi, my name's Zach Fleming. I'm a reporter at Radio New Zealand. I was just wondering if I could ask you guys a couple of questions.
No, you can just go off our property, please.
That's Hannah Tamaki. I left when she asked. She later posted this video to Facebook.
Somebody invaded my property a little while ago and they got telling off.
Radio New Zealand.
Radio New Zealand. They came in here, into our property, and all but demanded an interview, so they got the heave-hos.
I wanted to ask about Destiny School. Checkpoint revealed last month it applied to Kids Can for support. It's since withdrawn that request, saying it doesn't believe it'll be treated impartially. I wanted to ask about the church's financial situation. Destiny International and Te Hāhi o Ngā Matamua Holdings are so overdue with their financial returns, they have 2 weeks to file, or else the charities will be deregistered. And I wanted to ask about the Tamaki's obvious private wealth, which angers a lot of people because Destiny Church and its charities, which number at least 13, are tax exempt. But the Tamakis have refused every invitation to be interviewed. They instead post repeatedly on Facebook and Twitter about media coverage of these issues, labelling it fake news and a hate-inspired agenda. But Brian Tamaki earlier this month gave a rare insight into what he really thinks, especially about the frequent criticisms of his overt displays of wealth.
They are incredibly jealous about my life. They wanted to party here.
He delivered a sermon in Christchurch. The exact location was a well-kept secret.
You really got nothing until people get jealous around you. Jealousy is a part of the promotion of God.
The sermon was moved because gay rights activists said they'd crash it in protest at Mr. Tamaki's comments last year that homosexuality was to blame for the Christchurch earthquakes.
They were actively involved in homosexual practice, homosexual priests. The earth can speak. Leviticus says that the earth convulses under the weight of certain human sin.
Fast forward back to his sermon earlier this month.
If you had all the blessing you need, why would you be jealous of mine? That's right. That's right. And if you were doing well in God, why would you be jealous of me? That's right.
In other words, you're not fully blessed by God until you're as rich as Brian Tamaki. Envy is a cardinal sin, but Mr Tamaki believes we should aim for riches to inspire jealousy. Because remember,
you really got nothing until people get jealous around you.
And the media is simply picking on him, he says, because they have nothing better to do.
Surely there must be better news things than about picking on this half-caste Māori. The car he drives, and about what that he's on creaming you fellas for money. And if they say, I'm so rich and you're so poor, how do the two things happen? They say you're poor, and come on, no, you fellas didn't give I don't think anybody gave a $100 note in here tonight.
4 people did. It's not clear how many total were attending.
I ain't going to get rich on that. I'm not going to get rich on that. I didn't come here to get rich on you. You fellas gave nothing hard to. And I was expecting that. When you lot come with thousands of dollars to give, then maybe it's different.
Very true.
But then that should be normal. Because if you're giving thousands, that means you've got a lot of money.
Brian Tamaki wants Destiny Church members to strive for material wealth. Perhaps live a life like his, overseas holidays, luxury cars, multi-million-dollar homes. But is wealth a Christian virtue? The Tamakis won't comment, so I went to another branch of the Christian church.
Well, actually the Bible has a lot to say about people being rich, and it's usually pretty negative.
Helen Jacoby is the vicar of St Matthew's in Auckland's CBD.
Jesus famously said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter the kingdom of God.
Matthew 19:24. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, the love of money is the root of all evil.
Jesus says many times you need to let go of your wealth and your possessions in order to be close to God.
And if someone didn't take that advice?
He says that they won't be in the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. We don't talk so much about heaven and hell these days, but there are some pretty graphic descriptions of what might happen to someone if they didn't let go of that wealth. We don't take that so much literally, but it is certainly an encouragement and a challenge in the way that we deal with wealth, yes.
But just how rich are the Tamakis and their charities? Destiny Church's income primarily comes from donations. Members are encouraged to give 10% of their income. And at big events, cash, sometimes upwards of $20,000, is laid out on stage for everyone to see. In the 2016 financial year, Destiny's Auckland arm alone pulled in $4.4 million in donations. It's not known how much of that went into the Tamakis' pockets, but 6 unnamed key management personnel were paid nearly $600,000 in total.
Well, that is a good question.
That's Sue Barker, an expert in charities law, after I asked her whether accruing personal wealth through a charity could potentially be breaking the law.
The principle of charity is that funds raised must be used to further the charitable purposes, and generally that is inconsistent with the accumulation of private wealth.
So basically it's a grey area. I then asked Miss Barker to look at Destiny's recent financial returns.
There are a lot of separate entities within the whole entity that we would think of as Destiny Church.
At least 13 separate charities.
So I think really the thing that struck me the most from these financial statements is that you don't get a sense of the whole entity that is Destiny Group.
And that sense of Destiny Church's finances as a whole is something that's not been understood by people outside the church, because the rules around financial reporting used to be a lot more relaxed.
Prior to these rules, charities were often filing bank statements or handwritten financial or written calculations. There was no standard of reporting required to be met.
Then, in 2015, the rules changed drastically. Big charities now have to file detailed returns, similar to what's required for a business. But the 2 Destiny charities that are facing deregistration have never filed a return under the new rules. 1,920 organisations became a charity since the start of 2016. That's 3 a day. Ms Barker says that a review of the Charities Act is desperately needed.
The Charities Act, when it was originally passed, it was rushed through under urgency without proper consultation, and we have been waiting ever since for a first principles review of the Charities Act to be undertaken.
The National Party promised one, but reneged on that promise.
Would allow us an opportunity to look at whether the balance is in the right place and you know, whether the financial reporting rules are working as they should, whether the whole regime is working as it should. And I really think that we need to have that undertaken.
If the two Destiny charities facing deregistration do file by their November 3rd deadline, we may finally have a sense of how wealthy the church really is. But with the Tamakis placing assets in other people's names, we may likely never know how wealthy its founders have become. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
It's 25 minutes to 6. Let's get straight to the headlines with Anna Thomas.
The coalition agreement between Labour and New Zealand First contains significant policy gains for New Zealand First. Under the agreement, Labour will back New Zealand First's plan for a $1 billion a year regional development fund. And the parties have agreed to look at the feasibility of moving the Port of Auckland. It's also been agreed to strengthen the Overseas Investment Act and stop non-resident foreigners buying houses. The minimum wage will be increased to $20 an hour by 2020, and the Reserve Bank Act will be reviewed. And the deal includes provisions to stop MPs changing parties between elections. And there's a commitment to a free trade deal with Russia, and a criminal cases commission will be established to review cases of alleged injustice. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters will be Deputy Prime Minister in the new government, and his party will hold several portfolios, including foreign affairs, defence and regional development. The Greens Party's confidence and supply agreement with Labour also gives policy wins for the Greens. The welfare system is to be overhauled, with excessive sanctions to be removed, and a referendum will be held on the issue of legalising cannabis. The Greens will hold the climate change and conservation portfolios, but outside Cabinet. The National Party leader Bill English says he will stay on as party leader and lead it into the next election in 2020. He was unopposed in the party's caucus vote this afternoon. Mr English says the mood among his MPs was sober, but he says MPs believe the party is in a good position, considering National received more votes than Labour and New Zealand First combined. China's President Xi Jinping is set to increase his grip on power as the week-long Communist Party's Congress in Beijing draws to an end. The party is expected to enshrine his political ideology into his constitution, which may elevate him to the level of party founder Mao Zedong. And that's the news.
Kia ora, Anna. Well, dozens of workers from Fletcher Building businesses walked off the job this morning after pay negotiations with the country's biggest construction company stalled. Workers at Firth Concrete, Laminex, Myco Bathrooms and Winstones Aggregates picketed outside Fletcher Building's headquarters in Auckland, with other workers protesting outside work sites in the Upper North Island. Nita Blake-Person reports.
What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it?
There were plenty of supportive toots for the 25 or so workers gathered outside the company's Auckland headquarters today, but no one from Fletcher's was willing to come out and speak to them. It's been a rocky few months for the company. In August, major project losses, delays and asset write-downs caused their profit to plunge by 80%, from $462 million to $94 million in the year to June. Fletcher signalled the profit slump when it disclosed it would book hefty losses on two major projects, believed to be the Christchurch Justice Precinct and Auckland's International Convention Centre. But First Union Secretary for Manufacturing Jared Abbott says while the company's profit has dropped, the workers have still performed and they deserve a pay increase.
Some are only seeking around a 3% increase, some are seeking a wage adjustment to bring them in line with the market, which is really around $4 an hour, which might seem like a lot, but that's how much behind they are from other workers in the same industry.
But Mr Abbott says negotiations over pay increases have stalled. And while last year the company's chief executive was awarded a 17% pay increase to almost $5 million, workers were struggling to pay their rent.
Companies probably spent about less than an hour with us at the bargaining table, and we've just been frustrated with them coming back with the same offer. We need them to address some of the issues that are happening on the site, and the company want to take a blanket approach to bargaining.
Lee J. Kukutai was among those picketing today. He says he and his co-workers, some of whom are paid as low as the minimum wage, need better pay.
Some of them are still stuck in around just above the minimum wage or on minimum wage. I mean, a couple of the boys are still a bit tight-lipped about what they're actually getting. I think they're a bit embarrassed too.
It's not just the pay. He says the culture at Fletcher Building is the worst he has experienced in a workplace.
It's bad. And everyone that I've worked with, people from down the line and like all different Fletcher outfits, and they all say the same thing. So, yeah, it's basically just everyone separates themselves, and then all the people on the floor just get beat down every day.
Fletcher Building would not be interviewed today, but in a statement it said it values its nearly 10,000 employees who work across 30 different businesses throughout the country. It said it was expecting fewer than 45 people from 3 of its businesses to strike, but First Union said that number was closer to 100 workers. First Union's Jared Abbott says some workers are restricted from striking as they're only legally able to do so once their collective agreement expires, and Fletcher's has dozens of agreements with different expiry dates. But he says the majority of employees who are able to strike at the moment are doing so. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Nita Blake Person, tēnei.
Well, for more on Fletcher Building, here's our business reporter Nona Peltier. So, Nona, the company has placed itself in trading halt ahead of tomorrow's annual meeting. What's behind that suspension?
Well, they've had an independent auditor looking at their projects, the ones that have caused them all this grief. $292 million in losses just for these 2 projects. One of them is the Sky City, as you just heard, and the other is believed to be the Justice Precinct in Christchurch. Well, KPMG has been looking at that, and the company has put their shares in a trading halt, signaling that they're going to have to upgrade or change their guidance. So whether that's up or down, we don't know, but it's an ominous sign anyway when you put your company in a trading halt the day before your annual meeting. On a plus side, the company has announced that they're going to make some announcement about an appointment of a CEO after Mark Adamson lost his job as a result of what happened with those 2 projects. So that we're going to have tomorrow when the market opens. Following that, there'll be an annual meeting where we expect it to be quite noisy. Inside the meeting, the Shareholders Association are going to challenge the board. They're looking to unseat at least 1 member, and they're calling for some big changes at that governance level so that there's more expertise at the in building and construction, that kind of expertise. Meanwhile, the share price is down $7.96. That was before the trading halt. That was the last price on Friday. Well, anyway, somebody else thought that was probably a good deal. So Perpetual, which is an investor, already an investor in Fletcher, has increased their stake by 1 percentage point to 6.3%. They bought those shares over the past 2 months. So that's a long way down from where the high was. It was over $10, just like less than a year ago. So, yeah, it'll be an interesting day.
Sure will. Now, the niche dairy products company Lewis Road Creamery, it's found a major new shareholder to fund its expansion. Do we know who the shareholder is?
We do know who the shareholder is, but we don't know what the value of the stake is. So the company is called Southern Pastures, and I didn't know this, but they're the country's largest dairy farm investment fund. They have, investments in 19 farms. And so they want to invest in Lewis, and Lewis didn't say how much they got for it, but the founder, Peter Cullinane, says that he's still the largest shareholder, and he's going to use the money, how much it is, we do not know, to fund expansion overseas and product development. And who knows, one day, if the company gets big enough, they may actually start to source some of their dairy products from one of the southern farms.
Right,
Southern
now,
pastures, rather.
Another interesting development today with IRD, a change in regulations there.
Yeah, so for the first time, IRD is now reporting big tax debtors to credit agencies because they got complaints over many, many years of people doing business with companies that had huge tax debt that they didn't know about. So now those tax debts are going to be reported to credit agencies. There you go. First one done today. We don't know the name of the company, but if you're going to do business with them, I guess you'll find out.
And finally, what happened on the markets today, Nona?
Well, interestingly, our market has been showing this pattern where we see buying coming in the afternoon after some weakness in the morning. That was the pattern we saw today. So the top 50 index ended steady with Friday's record close at 8,130 points. In other words, it finished up the same. The dollar is trading lower. It has a weaker tone overnight. 69.33 US cents was the low. It's at 69.5. It's had a little bit of a movement down following all those announcements by the various leaders of various parties, including the ones that are going to form a government. 88.8 Australian, that's quite low, and 52.5 pence. So we'll be watching the markets over the next few days.
I'll say. Thank you very much, our business reporter, Nona Peltier. An advocate for people bullied in the workplace says victims are facing a legal merry-go-round and have no legal comeback. The director of Culture Safe New Zealand, Alan Hulse, says he feels like he's banging his head against a brick wall when he represents clients who have been bullied at work. Laura Tupou has the story.
RNZ spoke to a woman who we'll call Amanda. She says her life is being destroyed by workplace bullying. She moved to New Zealand with her partner for a better life, to buy a house and start a family. But after a year of being bullied by her boss, she's been on stress leave for 5 months and put on medication for anxiety and depression. This is not her real voice.
I was a mess. I was such a mess. She just had this thing on me. It was literally driving me nuts.
Amanda says she was ignored, undermined and intimidated. She says she went through an internal process with no success and has taken up a personal grievance, which is now with the Employment Relations Authority. Amanda's now waiting to hear back from the authority, but Alan Hulse from Culture Safe New Zealand says he's been down this road before and it's a dead end.
The authority, through their unwillingness to allow our clients to present the evidence, they're actually effectively condoning the bullying themselves by not enabling our clients to tell their stories and to have their cases judged on the facts.
WorkSafe New Zealand is in charge of regulating health and safety. When RNZ News approached the organisation asking about the process an employee takes to raise a bullying claim, we were referred to the ERA. The ERA then referred RNZ back to WorkSafe. And the same thing happened to Amanda. This is the exact issue Mr Hulse is trying to raise.
We're in a conundrum in New Zealand where neither of the agencies that employers are expected to go to when they're being bullied, neither of them can actually or will deal with the issue in the way that the legislation intends.
The ERA says generally only claims of unfair treatment within 3 months of the complaint being made will be considered. WorkSafe says it will only investigate the most serious workplace bullying where there's a medical diagnosis linked to bullying, such as depression. But since WorkSafe's inception 4 years ago, it's never prosecuted any person or organisation for bullying. A professor of work and organisation at Massey University, Tim Bentley, says there are issues with WorkSafe's ability to respond to cases.
I think they would either need a lot of cases occurring or very serious cases before their mechanism for intervening is triggered.
Professor Bentley was the lead researcher in a study that found nearly 1 in 5 people are bullied in the workplace. He says there's room for WorkSafe to do more, but he says the ideal situation would be for matters to be settled at work using WorkSafe's guidelines that would avoid legal action. Alan Hulse says he's taken more than 20 cases to WorkSafe, none of which have been properly investigated. He says he'll be asking the incoming Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety for a more streamlined process for workplace bullying claims. Meanwhile, Amanda is awaiting the outcome for her ERA claim and wants this all behind her so she can continue her pursuit of the Kiwi dream. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Laura Tupou aho.
Two families from Tuvalu who sought to be New Zealand's first climate change refugees have had their cases rejected. The Immigration and Protection Tribunal ruled they did not risk being persecuted under the Refugee Convention. Our immigration reporter Jill Bonnet has been looking at the cases and told me why the families applied for asylum.
Both families argued that they wouldn't have access to clean and sanitary drinking water and that they were worried about the impact of climate change on their lives and their livelihoods. The couple in one of the cases came to New Zealand to look after elderly relatives, and they would have been returning there with two very young children, and so they were concerned about health standards and the impacts of their climate change and unemployment. They lived on Funafuti Atoll, which is 2.5 square kilometres. It is exposed to the sea, it has rising sea levels, land erosion is a serious problem. They believed that life in Tuvalu would no longer be sustainable. Both families pointed to rising sea levels, poor access to clean water and the country's high unemployment, which is at about 40%.
So why were their cases rejected?
Well, to qualify for refugee status, an asylum seeker, their predicament must be grounded in one of the 5 refugee convention grounds, and they are race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Now, in this case, the tribunal decided that returning to Tuvalu would pose challenges for them socioeconomically and also the impact of climate change, but it couldn't find a basis for arguing that any harm that they would face as a result of the adverse impacts of climate change had any link at all to any of those 5 convention grounds.
And how common are these cases?
There have been about more than a dozen cases in the last 6 years or so in New Zealand. Climate change was used successfully in one immigration case in 2014. But that was slightly different. That was as a humanitarian appeal against deportation. And in that case, a couple were granted residence. In that case, other factors were also high in the tribunal's mind. This particular couple had very strong family networks and connections in New Zealand. It was probably the case of Ioane Teisiota from Kiribati that really brought or renewed attention to whether climate change could in fact lead to people abandoning low-lying Pacific islands. You may remember that he sought to be the world's first climate change refugee. He was citing king tides and storm surges that were damaging the coastline, eroding the coastline and ruining crops. But as in these 2 current cases, the upshot of that case was that the consequences of climate change are not grounds for gaining refugee status.
And that's our immigration reporter Jill Bonnet. The public spat between the White House and the widow of a fallen soldier has taken another turn. David Johnson was one of 4 US troops killed on duty in Niger. Today his wife spoke out, asking why she hasn't been able to see her husband's body and calling for answers about what happened to him. But it's the condolence call between President Trump and Mrs. Johnson which continues to spark controversy. The BBC's North America editor John Sopel reports.
Sergeant David Johnson was laid to rest at the weekend, but there's no resting in peace. Instead, there's sound and fury. His widow, Maisha Johnson, has spoken for the first time about the now infamous call from President Trump.
The president said that he knew what he signed up for, but it hurts anyways. And it made me cry because I was very angry at the tone of his voice and how he said it. Like he couldn't remember my husband's name.
She also revealed that the US military refused to let her see her husband's body.
I don't know nothing. They won't show me a finger, a hand. I know my husband's body from head to toe, and they won't let me see anything. I don't know what's in that box. It could be empty for all I know, but I need to see my husband.
The phone call from Donald Trump came last week as the Johnson family waited at Miami airport to receive his body. But after Maisha Johnson's interview today, the President tweeted within an hour to challenge her account. I had a very respectful conversation with the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson and spoke his name from beginning without hesitation. The White House had been hoping the focus relentlessly this week would be on tax reform and no other distractions. But the President felt he had to respond to the fallen soldier's widow. It seems this is a President who prefers an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth than he does turning the other cheek. The President this evening has been presiding over a ceremony giving a Vietnam War veteran his Medal of Honor, even though Donald Trump, like many other wealthy young men, managed to avoid the draft himself. America's wars and how it treats its military families, a source of conflict then, a source of conflict today.
It's the BBC's John Sopel reporting. The historic Sutton Bridge near Middlemarch in Otago is being removed, but its future remains unclear. Engineers today began dragging out the main bridge, which collapsed in the Taieri flood in July. The 140-year-old suspension bridge was nearing the end of a major strengthening process when the second largest flood in the area on record destroyed it. Our Otago Southland reporter Ian Telfer watched the removal today. And we seem to be having some problems with that audio, so we'll move on. The Veterinary Council says it doesn't like the practice of putting down healthy animals, but it says vets do get asked to do it. Over the weekend, a Facebook post showing a healthy cat taken to a vet in Palmerston North for euthanasia has drawn attention to the practice, which one vet says gets worse as the holidays approach. Katie Gossett reports.
Christchurch vet Heather Remnant is in the business of making animals feel better, but she's sometimes asked to do the opposite, to put a healthy pet down. And it gets worse as Christmas looms.
Leading up to major holidays, Christmas and things, where people will come in and they'll tell us that an animal's elderly, not doing that well, and want it put down, and on exam we'll discover that the cat's 5 years old and in fact in quite good health.
Heather Remnant says most owners in this situation are at their wits' end as a result of a change in circumstances, such as the move overseas or the earthquakes, when many people lost their homes and couldn't find rentals that would allow pets. She says her staff are very successful at rehoming animals, and most owners will happily agree to that outcome. But there are some cases that haunt her, including that of a divorcing couple who were determined that neither should get to keep their cat.
They were very, very aggressive about the whole idea. They wanted the cat put down. He didn't want her to have it. She didn't want him to have it. So the only option that they could see was that the cat went to heaven, and that was it. And that was their way of hurting each other. And they brought it into the clinic and they insisted I did it in front of them. Or they were going to go home and dong it on the head with something. You know, occasionally you get stuck between a rock and a hard place and you have to do these things, but you don't forget them.
The Veterinary Council says often euthanasia will be asked for when an elderly owner is going into a rest home or someone has developed an allergy to a pet. But a spokesperson, Wayne Ricketts, says most vets will rehome a healthy animal, often at their own expense, rather than put it down.
We just don't like it, and we certainly don't like euthanizing animals because the owners become sick of them, as it were, or they no longer want them. I mean, owning an animal, you are taking on a long-term responsibility for that animal's life.
The Veterinary Association says vets can refuse to euthanize a healthy animal, but only if they are sure the animal's well-being will not be compromised as a result. A spokesperson, Helen Beattie, says often the reasons for putting a healthy pet down are legitimate, but it's not something that a vet would take lightly.
I think most veterinarians would feel pretty uncomfortable about there being any sort of frivolity with respect to an animal's life just because it didn't suit. However, it's also a bell curve, it's a spectrum, that's humanity, and there are going to be really challenging cases that are put up and put in front of vets, and that's where, we trust that our membership is going to make the right decisions around that and provide good advice and alternatives.
Helen Beattie says it's a privilege to be able to use euthanasia to relieve suffering, and it's in that context that most vets would view it. For Checkpoint, Katie Gossett.
Coming up after 6 o'clock tonight, well, after weeks of secret talks, the details of Labour's deal with New Zealand First and the Greens have finally been revealed. We'll have more on that, much more on that after 6. Meanwhile, Bill English has this afternoon been re-elected unopposed as the leader of the National Party, and he's promising to stay on until 2020 and fight to win the next election. Also after 6, a group representing people suffering complications from surgical mesh are relieved the Ministry of Health has finally agreed to take some action. And we'll return to Ian Telfer's story about the historic Sutton Bridge near Middlemarch in Otago. Don't forget, you can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. And you can watch us online on Facebook Live at rnz.co.nz/checkpoint, on Freeview Channel 50 and on Face TV Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. The highly secretive deals to form a government have finally been unveiled, revealing exactly how far Labour was prepared to go in order to take power. There are a few surprises, including new waka jumping legislation and work towards restarting trade talks with Russia. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The centrepiece of the deal with New Zealand First is regional development with a new $1 billion fund. There's also a commitment to scale back on immigration, but not as much as New Zealand First would have wanted. While not in the actual agreement, the new government will ban foreign purchases of residential houses and tighten access to farmland. All parties agreed to establish a climate commission to decide if and when agriculture will be included in the emissions trading scheme. Under the Greens agreement, there will be an overhaul of the welfare system to remove what are described as excessive sanctions. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
The agreement between Labour and the Greens says Auckland's controversial East-West Link highway will not go ahead as currently proposed. The Transport Agency is planning to build a 4-lane highway between Penrose and Onehunga at a cost of $2 billion. It says the area is a key piece of the country's transport network and is currently heavily congested. In the election campaign, the Greens said the highway was a waste of money, while Labour said they would look for less expensive options. Instead, the agreement commits the new government to begin work on light rail between the central city and the airport. The Mental Health Commission will be re-established under the coalition agreement. There'll also be a free annual health check, including an eye check for seniors as part of the Super Gold Card. Free teen health checks for all Year 9 students will be provided, along with free GP visits for all under 14-year-olds. As well, the new coalition government says it will raise the age limit for free breast screening progressively from 69 at present to 74. A Northland Transport spokesman says the most pressing question for the region under a new government is what happens to the Transport Agency's plan for a 4-lane highway to Auckland. The Northland Regional Councillor John Bain says there's no doubt that Northport at Marsden Point could be developed to handle Auckland's container traffic, a move New Zealand First has campaigned on. But he says the port could not function without a new highway linking Whangarei to the Auckland motorway.
The reality is that to get the goods to Point South, you have to have a very efficient system of transporting those containers or what comes out of the container. And then we could have a road system to move it wherever or a rail system. But the rail system is very expensive to take from the 1800s into the 21st century.
John Bain says building new rail links from Northport to Auckland should also be looked at, but the new road is critical and remains the priority. Schools will get more funding for gifted students and safer cycling and walking routes for their students in today's agreements. The agreements also give New Zealand First an Associate Education Minister role in the next government. The coalition deal with New Zealand First also includes development of a 30-year strategic plan for education, free driver training for secondary school students, and piloting the provision of counsellors in primary schools. The agreement with the Greens supports priorities, including ensuring all special needs children can participate fully in school life, providing safer cycling and walking around schools, and making tertiary education more affordable. Bill English has been re-elected unopposed as the leader of the National Party, and Mr English says he plans to stay on until 2020 and contest the next election for National. It's traditional for National to confirm or contest the leader's position after an election, and Mr English emerged from today's caucus meeting saying he's still in charge.
Well, I can confirm that today the National Party caucus re-elected me as its leader, along with Paula Bennett as deputy leader. I've committed to leading the National Party into opposition. We are the strongest opposition the New Zealand Parliament has seen.
Mr English says the mood of the National Party caucus is sober but positive. He says while MPs are disappointed they're not in government, they're looking forward to holding the new government to account. Two families from Tuvalu have had their claims to be climate change refugees turned down. They argued they and their children would not have access to clean and sanitary drinking water, and that life on Tuvalu was not sustainable because of rising sea levels, storms and king tides. But the Immigration and Protection Tribunal ruled they do not risk being persecuted under any part of the Refugee Convention. More than a dozen people have applied for refugee status because of climate change. It's 6:05. The former Black Caps batsman Michael Papps has shown that despite being in his 20th season of first-class cricket, his appetite for runs remains unabated. Papps has scored 316 not out in Wellington's first innings of 553 for 3 declared against Auckland in their opening Plunket Shield match of the season at the Basin Reserve, as the home side posted a 491-run first innings lead. Papps, who's 38, is the first Wellington player to score a triple century. He combined with Luke Woodcock, who made 151 to score 432 for the opening wicket, surpassing Peter Ingram and Jamie Howe's 428-run stand for Central Districts in the 2009-2010 season. Papps' innings included 51 fours and 1 6 and lasted over 9 hours. Olympic champion Mahe Drysdale has had his first day back with the national rowing squad since winning gold at the Rio Olympics. Drysdale took 10 months off from the sport after Rio and says he put on 20 kg as he took a complete break from training. He resumed training in July but only got back out on the water with the national squad today at Lake Karapiro. Despite Robbie Manson posting a world best time for the singles scull earlier this year, Drysdale's confident he can regain the singles scull spot in the squad.
The start back time for the summer squad was today, so that was my first row back with a squad, and the goal was to be able to complete the training in a reasonable shape and be able to at least compete with the guys, and I feel like I'm in that position, so the first goal's ticked off.
Mahe Drysdale, and that's the news.
This week on Nights, Miranda Marasiadis, one of the brains behind a Kiwi take on the surrealist artist Salvador Dali, called The Dance of the Lobsters. He had a thing for them, apparently. Motoko Kakubayashi reports in from Japan, bracing itself for a visit from Donald Trump. And this week's cultural ambassador, our South American music aficionado Mona Lynn Cortot, introduces us to Cumbia, the 4-square Latin beat. On Nights this week, with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now looking at the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to the Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty in the central high country. Long, fine spells and isolated showers. Rain developing from Taranaki southwards tomorrow night. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, mostly fine, however a few showers this evening, possibly heavy. Showers returning to Wairarapa late tomorrow. Orowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson. Mainly fine, however light rain tomorrow night. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, fine spells and a few showers. Rain in Fiordland this evening, spreading elsewhere tomorrow morning, briefly heavy. Rain clearing from the south tomorrow evening. Canterbury and Otago, fine apart from isolated afternoon showers in the east. A period of rain spreading northwards tomorrow with southerlies. For Southland, mostly fine, but rain developing overnight, then clearing tomorrow afternoon. And for the Chatham Islands, a period of rain today, followed by a few showers. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6 and you're listening to Checkpoint with Sharon Brett Kelly.
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, after weeks of secret talks, the details of Labour's deals with New Zealand First and the Greens have finally been revealed. The incoming Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, signed the agreements with the leaders of the two parties at Parliament this afternoon. So just how far was Labour prepared to go to take power? Our political reporter Sarah Robson has more.
It was all smiles as the incoming Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, signed Labour's coalition deal with the New Zealand First leader, Winston Peters. The centrepiece of the deal is regional development, with a new $1 billion development fund. Ms Ardern says New Zealand First advocated strongly during the negotiations for the regions, which she says have been neglected over the last 9 years. She was asked how the new fund would be paid for.
Well, that comes from the $10 billion of unallocated capital spending that we've set out in our fiscal plan across 4 years. So that's where that fund comes from. It will be a combination of investment in, for instance, regional rail, heavy investment in forestry.
But the deal didn't go as far on immigration as Winston Peters would have liked, sticking to Labour's plan to reduce net migration by 20 to 30,000.
Look, I accept that, but we went into negotiations sincerely to try and get a resolution, and we're happy to accept the resolution the way the Labour Party has framed it. And it just so happens that there's an enormous amount of public controversy about those two issues right now, carried by you in the media and carried by experts. So maybe it'll work out.
But there were a couple of surprises. Winston Peters wants work to get underway again towards a free trade deal with Russia. And he also wants new waka jumping legislation. He says he never understood why the original legislation, which came into effect in the early 2000s, had a sunset clause.
If you're a list member, then that's it. But if you're a constituency member, well, put it back to the electorate. And I know something personally about doing that, in terms of walking out, resigning and putting it to the electorate to gain a mandate. So I'm not preaching some sort of philosophy here. I'm preaching some practical thing that I believe in.
As expected, the Greens' confidence in supply agreement includes a referendum on legalising cannabis, which will be held at or by the 2020 election. There is also an overhaul of the welfare system, including ensuring access to entitlements and removing excessive sanctions. On the transport front, Auckland's east-west motorway link won't proceed in its current form, and work will begin on light rail from Auckland's CBD to the airport. The Greens leader, James Shaw, says it's an historic day.
I mean, the fact that we have the agreement, the fact that we are entering government for the first time, and that we have ministers who are going to be responsible for implementing a significant portion of the agenda that we campaigned on.
Tomorrow, Jacinda Ardern will announce the ministerial lineup of the new coalition government. Atu i te whare pāremata mō te hōtaka o te ahi ko Sarah Robson, aho.
Bill English has been re-elected unopposed as the leader of the National Party, and he's promising to stay on till 2020 and fight to win the next election. Political reporter Benedict Collins has more.
Bill English emerged from the National Party's first caucus meeting since it learned it wouldn't be in government, with his leadership intact.
Well, I can confirm that today the National Party caucus re-elected me as its leader, along with Paula Bennett as deputy leader. I've committed to leading the National Party into opposition. We are the strongest opposition the New Zealand Parliament has seen. We will go into the House with more seats than the Labour New Zealand First coalition government.
Mr English says he wants to remain the leader of the opposition until the next election, and says he's up for the scrap.
My performance will be in question, it will be under scrutiny just like everybody else's. That's what happens in opposition. But we do have a quite unique situation here. That is an opposition where 44.5% of New Zealanders voted for it, and we have a government with a much less confident view about New Zealand, who have already tried to lower expectations. Now that's a fight worth getting into.
Mr English described the mood of the National Party caucus as sober but positive.
They're disappointed they're not in government. I outlined the results of the negotiations to them last Thursday. Like I was, they were satisfied that could have been the basis for a strong government. But look, that business has been done.
Before today's caucus, the senior National MP Stephen Joyce indicated Bill English had the strong backing of caucus to remain as leader.
It's an unusual result, and it's not often that you lead your party to a 44.5% after 3 terms in government and go into opposition. So I think we should encourage him to stay. I know that's what everybody will be doing, but ultimately it's his call, and no doubt he'll say so at some point.
The National MP for Papakura, Judith Collins, also backed Mr English to stay on and says she's not going anywhere either.
Is the Pope Catholic? Of course I'm staying. I've been re-elected in Papakura electorate with a vastly increased majority from last time. I'm absolutely invigorated. Just being an MP is a wonderful privilege, and I'm very happy to be one.
However, while Nationals leaders have accepted the Labour and New Zealand First coalition government as legitimate, the party's new MP for Northland, Matt King, took to Facebook at the weekend to say it amounts to an arrogant grab of unmandated power. Mr King says there is a sense of outrage that natural justice has been denied, with National not being in power, and he claimed the new government has no moral authority. Stephen Joyce says Mr King has already rethought that post, which has been deleted.
It is probably just reflecting some of the frustration of the supporters, but I don't think there's any point arguing with the referee on these things. You know the rules of the game as you go into it, so there's no point getting into that. I'm suggesting some of the things he suggested and others have suggested is going a wee bit too far.
The National Party's senior whip, Jamie Lee Ross, was also re-elected, as were the second and junior whips. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Benedict Collins.
A group representing people suffering complications from surgical mesh are relieved the Ministry of Health has finally agreed to take some action. The Ministry will look into the cost of establishing a register of users of the devices following a meeting with advocacy group Mesh Down Under, medical groups and ACC. Adriana Weber reports.
The surgical treatment has seen ACC pay out more than $13 million in injury claims to more than 800 patients in the past 12 years. Some of the injuries have involved mesh eroding in the body or binding with other tissue, causing extreme pain or infections. The Director of Protection, Regulation and Assurance at the Health Ministry, Stuart Jessamine, says it's now agreed to carry out a cost-benefit analysis of setting up a register, which would help track the number of patients with side effects.
What we currently have with the ACC in the MedSafe data and the data that has been collected through groups like Mesh Down Under is, we know there's a number of people who have been affected by this with quite serious side effects. What we don't know is how many people have had the surgery and not had side effects.
The Mesh Down Under group has been battling for years to get a register to track all mesh implants. A group spokeswoman, Patricia Sullivan, says it's a huge relief that more has now been done, as a lack of action under the previous government was absolutely horrifying.
We have to have a look at the last government, and health funding has been cut, and we're aware of that. It has been extremely difficult to get any movement in this direction, so we feel really hopeful that with this new government things will move more rapidly. We feel that we're going to be much more supported.
Another group member, Carmel Berry, has suffered serious complications from mesh implants herself. She says a register would help identify complications sooner, meaning patients may not have to wait as long in future for an answer to any problem.
You have an implant put in, a sticker's put on your patient notes, and that's the end of it. So if down the track it's discovered that that particular lot number or brand of mesh has high complications rate, apart from actually physically going through every hospital's patient notes one by one, it would be impossible to find the people that have got potentially problematic implants.
Dr Stuart Jessamine says it has also agreed to set up a working group to progress recommendations from Parliament's Health Select Committee on the topic. He says the group wants to find ways to minimise harm in the future.
There's an awful lot of lessons here for healthcare practitioners, and ministries of health and agencies such as MedSafe can extract from this tragedy to try to make sure that we are more aware to this going forward.
He says the cost-benefit analysis should be conducted within 6 months. For Checkpoint, Adriana Weber.
When will it end is what aid workers in Bangladesh are asking about the human tide of Rohingya refugees continuing to cross from Myanmar. Almost 2 months after the crisis began, nearly 600,000 have fled the military-led violence, and still more are on the way. At a conference in Switzerland, the United Nations is seeking urgent funding. The ABC's South Asia correspondent James Bennett reports.
The plight of Rohingya refugees may have slid from popular attention, but not Libby Bowles.
To be truthful, this is the worst thing I've ever seen.
The Australian nurse and Red Cross worker speaks from experience. In 2015, Libby Bowles was given the Florence Nightingale Humanitarian Award for her work on Africa's Ebola crisis. Confounding her is the still ceaseless stream of Rohingya refugees coming from Myanmar, even as the 2-month total approaches 600,000.
We get this false lull that we had just before the 15,000 came, and I actually went down to the border and had a look and just saw what, the drone shots that are around now. I saw that and I just thought, oh my God.
She describes in haunting terms the difficulty of seeing babies and elderly dying of thirst in the tropical heat.
When you see the new arrivals and the state of these people, I've never seen so many malnourished little babies and children and old people, old women and soulless women. I've seen just death behind their eyes, and that's a really awful thing to see. That's probably what's sticking with me at the moment quite a lot, because I saw that just over and over and over again 2 days ago.
The problems of so many in such little space are manifest. Attempts to dig wells for clean water have so far yielded insufficient supply, exacerbating aid agencies' biggest fear, cholera. Later today in Switzerland, the UN will plead for additional urgent assistance. The World Food Programme's Michael Dunford.
WFP's already fed 580,000 refugees. Just yesterday, we fed an additional 10,000 as they came across the border. But we're still scaling up. We still need to reach up to 1 million people. We've received strong support from our donors, but we need an additional 54 million to get us through until the end of February if we are able to reach our targets.
Save the Children's Matt Tinkler has just returned from Bangladesh and says it's also imperative to look beyond food and shelter. The challenge, he says, is understandable concern in Bangladesh that one of the world's poorest countries is facing a long-term burden it simply can't bear alone.
We need to learn from places like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey that have hosted significant refugee populations fleeing Syria for many years now. And in that scenario, we probably took too long to set up a medium and longer term response to that emerging crisis, and we need to make sure we don't make the same mistake here.
With no end in sight, the Red Cross's Libby Bowles agrees.
I wish I could say I could see it getting better, but when we've still got another couple of 100,000 on the other side of the border, we're a bit of a way off.
This week will mark 2 months since August 25, when Rohingya insurgent attacks on security posts triggered a vicious counter-offensive by the Myanmar army. There are allegations the military is starving out the remaining Rohingya, laying siege to their villages. But exactly what is happening inside Rakhine State is still not well known, with Myanmar continuing to resist calls for improved humanitarian access.
James Bennett with that report. Plans for a large and expensive dam in the Tasman region have been ticking away for about a decade now. The arguments for and against the proposed $82 million Waimea Community Dam are heating up, with the Tasman Council saying the cost to half of its ratepayers could be anything up to $160 a year extra. Coinciding with this is the launch of 2 public groups. One says the dam is vital for the region's economy and its future, while the other says it's likely to be a waste of ratepayer money. Our Nelson reporter Tracy Neal has more.
The lush Waimea Plains grow much of the food the region consumes or exports. A former Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment says water will become increasingly scarce in what is one of the country's fastest growing regions. Morgan Williams is among a new wave of arrivals to Tasman and says the dry spells will only get worse.
I don't accept the premise that water supply is secure into the future. The evidence is just too solid. Not just the evidence from this catchment and these aquifers, but the evidence of what's going on in terms of river flows, anywhere where you're getting this variability increasing.
Mr Williams heads the newly formed Water Solutions Advisory Group. He says the group hasn't been set up to side with the Tasman Council, which is driving the project along with irrigators in the district, but it does believe the dam is the best option. He says the region, like the rest of the country, has been sleepwalking through the impending effects of climate change.
It's a problem of us as a society that we're comfortable and we don't always understand just how big some of the things that are going to affect our future are. And they're here today, they're not tomorrow.
The dam was first mooted a decade ago but was stalled by disagreement over an earlier funding model. The Tasman Council's share in the construction cost is about $27 million and a little over $700,000 a year in operating expenses. It says ratepayers could expect annual increases of between $29 and up to $160 to help pay for it, depending on where they live. The head of a newly formed opponent group, Murray Dawson, says residents aren't being told all the facts.
The main misunderstanding of the issue is this. The river's gone dry, or we're desperately short of water. Most of the water from Tasman District Council urban supply comes out of the ground. We have tens of millions of cubes in the ground.
Mr Dawson says water use is declining with changed land use. The dam has the stirrings of support from Tasman's neighbour, the Nelson City Council, which recently agreed to seek feedback on an option to grant $5 million to the project. Mayor Rachel Rees says it's an opportunity to work cooperatively on large regional projects.
Focusing on an arbitrary division between the border of our two councils ignores the fact that communities and economies of the two districts are inextricably intertwined.
Ms Rees says analysis by the Institute of Economic Research shows the dam would deliver more than $20 million worth of GDP benefit to Nelson City alone.
So I think we should seriously consider the role that this dam plays in the Nelson-Tasman regional economy.
The Tasman Mayor Richard Kempthorne is urging residents to learn more about the proposal and to make a submission. Public feedback is open now until late November. In Nelson for Checkpoint, Tracy Neal.
The historic Sutton Bridge near Middlemarch in Otago is being removed, but its future remains unclear. Engineers today began dragging out the main bridge, which collapsed in the Taieri flood in July. The 140-year-old suspension bridge was nearing the end of a major strengthening process when the second largest flood in the area on record destroyed it. Our Otago Southland reporter Ian Telfer watched the removal today.
It's been 3 months since the Sutton Bridge was smashed up in the Taieri flood. 3 earth-moving machines and a troop of engineers slowly pulled it in half today and dragged one side up a nearby bank. One of those watching was Dunedin City Council Transportation Delivery Manager, Josh Von Pine.
This is an exciting day, yeah, for sure. It's not too often within the DCC network that we have a bridge collapse, so it's something that we've been looking forward to and working with the community to get some conclusions.
A small band of local farm workers came to watch the action, saying they were glad to see the mess being cleaned up at last. But it didn't all go to plan. Having dragged half the bridge out of the Taieri River, the diggers struggled to get it up the bank. The bridge groaned, heavy steel cables snapped. But tempers didn't fray, and after 4 hours they got there. The big question is, why did it collapse this time after having survived so many floods before? Built in 1875, the Sutton Suspension Bridge near Middlemarch was in the process of being restored by the Dunedin City Council when the second largest flood on record hit the Taieri River. It's thought scaffolding on the bridge acted like a dam and brought it down. Mr Von Pine says that's not confirmed because the investigation's not complete.
The consultants we've got looking at it first want to have a look at the bridge out of the water because up until today a lot of the bridge structure's been covered by debris and a metre of water, so we've not been able to have a good look at all the components of it, but after today the consultant should be able to have a better look at it and start looking at those modes of failure.
The heritage pillars have been removed stone by stone, and they lie in long lines on the site next to the suspension wires and all the other pieces, numbered and ready for storage. The even bigger question is if the bridge will be restored and at what cost. The Strathtyre Community Board's been pushing for answers and says the community wants it restored if possible. But Mr Von Pine's not making promises.
Once we get the report back, we'll be able to talk about options, or options will be presented to council, and we'll be able to know a bit more after that. And at that time we'll also be consulting heavily with the local community boards and obviously with the elected members.
Are you hopeful?
I'm always hopeful, but I really couldn't comment about the chances. No.
The rest of the bridge will be removed tomorrow, and the draft report on why it fell down should be finished in about 3 weeks. In Sutton for Checkpoint, Ian Telfer.
We've had this email from Alistair Foster about euthanising pets. He says if a healthy pet is taken to the vet for euthanasia and the vet is concerned for the animal's well-being if they refuse, then surely the vet must have the right to seize the animal in order to refer it to a welfare agency. If not, then this is a shortcoming in the law. Well, that's Checkpoint for this evening. Thanks for joining us on your radio, your television, online, or however you chose to connect with us today. You can hear highlights in late edition at 10:15 this evening, or any of our stories tonight on rnz.co.nz/checkpoint. And for all the latest news, information, feature stories from New Zealand and around the world, go to the rnz.co.nz homepage. So from me, Sharon Brett-Kelly, and the Checkpoint team, have a great night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Overseas investment rules will be strengthened as a result of the coalition agreement between Labour and New Zealand First. A new regional development fund is also to be introduced. The Greens have won agreement to overhaul the welfare system and remove excessive sanctions. And Auckland's $2 billion east-west motorway between Onehunga and Penrose will be put on hold, while work will begin on light rail between the CBD and the airport. Meanwhile, Bill English says he will stay on as National Party leader. Our next news and weather is at 7 o'clock.
Courtney Barnett comes from Melbourne, Kurt Vile from Philadelphia, and they bring together their guitars and downbeat singing in a new album of duets. I'm Nick Bollinger and I'll be reviewing Lotta Sea Lice in the sampler. I'll be discussing St Vincent's mass seduction and wondering who's being seduced. Plus, a solo flight for a former bird, which might double as a swan song from Tom Petty. That's in the sampler, tonight at 7:30. Part of Nights with Brian Crump on RNZ National.
And this is Trending Now, our feature highlighting the stories you've been sharing via digital and social media. First, from This Way Up at the weekend, this extraordinary story about opioid abuse